Well, let me tell you about our panellists. They come from across the industry. We're going to be joined on stage by Plummer, the Commercial Director of Auto Trader, and by Rachel Wolf, the founding partner of Public First and the author of today's SMMT Competitiveness Report. And then we're going to be joined virtually through the magic of technology by Neill, the Chief Executive of Unipart Group. And before any of them come on stage, we're going to have a quick 90-second teaser to give you some idea of what we're going to be talking about in the next half an hour. So if we could have the video.
We have more vehicle manufacturers and winning Formula One teams in this country than anywhere else in the world. So we should prize our industry, we should nurture it, and we should do everything possible to scale it up.
We saw massive digital acceleration with the share of retail sales completed online leaping forward by the equivalent of 12 years of growth in the space of just 12 months.
The UK squandered the opportunity many decades ago to be one of the biggest vehicle manufacturers in the world, with all the prosperity that would have brought to our country. We need to make sure that we don't do that again.
There's untapped value in our car industry that can be unleashed if we can sustain the focus on transformation with greater openness, partnership, and a resolute focus on smarter use of data.
Perfect, excellent. To get us going, Rachel, I want to start with you. Obviously, you wrote today's report. We've heard quite a lot about it from Mike already, but just give us a sense in your own words of what Britain needs to do to retain or achieve competitiveness, particularly when we're looking at electric vehicles.
So my background is politics and policy, and my last sort of big policy role was one of the authors of the 2019 election manifesto for our Conservative government. And the thing that really struck me when we were doing this report is how utterly central this industry is to all of the government's overarching competitive objectives and domestic policy goals. So it is trying to level up the country, which means that it is trying to give people in all of these areas in the North and the Midlands and Wales who voted for this government a better quality of life and the promise of great jobs. And when we did focus groups for this report, as well as looking at the data, what is very obvious is these are exactly the jobs that the government is trying to create and create more of. They are jobs that people have deep pride in, which allow them to support their family, are skilled, create opportunities, and are exactly the places that the government wants to grow. And of course, these are also places that rely completely on cars. When you're in Westminster, people like to talk about trains a lot because we're all in Westminster and we're in London. But of course, in most of the country, people are utterly dependent on cars. And if we want them to switch to electric vehicles, they need to find them convenient to use and affordable in the places that they are so that they can carry on with their jobs. And then you look at global Britain, where what this government is trying to do with both its net zero targets and in general is say that they are a leader of the world and to forge trade deals and increase exports. And a huge part of its general net zero promises in its 10-point plan is for, yet again, high quality jobs in the North and in the Midlands that are going to create export opportunities. And these are exactly what the automotive industry currently has, could grow, but could also lose. So when we looked at the report and we did some competitive indexing against other countries and also some modelling about different policy scenarios, we looked at what those opportunities and risks are. And Mike already talked about a lot of it, but clearly this is a country and an industry with immense strengths in terms of skills, R&D, technological capacity, adaptivity, an existing diverse industry, which you could imagine continuing to grow. But what it has not yet done, unlike many other countries, is put the big steps in place that are going to allow it to transition from a massive government intervention and demand, which is this shift to net zero. So what we did in the report is look at a whole host of things across a roadmap to 2030, which is obviously when the government's task is, in terms of battery supply, in terms of skills, in terms of actually allowing individuals to switch to electric vehicles and have the charging infrastructure to do so, and in terms of supporting that industry transition, that if you get right, could result in more of those jobs the government wants, but if you get wrong, will result in fewer.
So it sounds very much like actually it's on a knife edge at the moment, that it could even now go either way, either very well if you're looking at that 80 gigawatt hour scenario, or very badly if you're looking at the 15. But what is the time frame about this, right? And how is it within 12 months we will know whether we've made the right decisions? 24 months? How soon does this stuff have to happen?
It's a great question, and in the roadmap we set out effectively a kind of 3-stage process. And obviously not every decision needs to be made in the next 12 months, but I would say that there are a whole host of strategies, funds and actions that we are waiting for right now from the government, particularly around net zero. And if those strategies do not set out a very clear path towards making that transition, again, both for individuals and families as well as for industry, it's hard to see how it's going to catch up. And we do work in a lot of other countries, and of course, every country makes the same claim, right? Every country says they're going to create great competitive advantage and they're going to create more exports from net zero. Every country has a long list of things that they're doing to support specific industries or people that they kind of proudly shout. But when you weigh them up, we're not yet in the top tier.
Okay. That's very interesting, because Britain does certainly pitch itself as the top tier.
As do we all.
Of course we do. Of course we do. John, can I bring you in if you can hear us clearly? You've had a long and glorious history in the auto industry, but from your past experiences, what do you think we can learn from the past when we look at this industry strategically for the future?
Well, Peter, thanks for the question, and it's great to be with everyone virtually today. I've been in this industry, as you say, for about 40 years, and I've watched with dismay as we squandered the opportunity to be one of the biggest car manufacturers in the world. As George Santayana said, if those that cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. So if we just go back to the 60s and the 70s, at that time we were making around 2 million cars a year. The Japanese were making 500,000. And we were making probably some of the most innovative products in the world. The Mini, the Range Rover, it was 20 years ahead of its time, ahead of the SUV revolution. The E-Type Jaguar, still the most beautiful car ever made. And so what happened? Well, along came Japan, a small island nation, far from its customers, no natural resources other than the talent and commitment of its people and its government. And what happened? 10 years later, they were making 10 times as many cars, and we were still making 2 million. Before COVID, they were making 10 million, and we were stuck between 1 and 2. So let's see what we can learn from the past. What went wrong? Well, firstly, great cars badly put together, weak management, Luddite trade unions led by Trots and Maoists who were hell-bent on destroying the industry, and a government that couldn't take a long-term view and kept on changing with stop-go policies, treating the industry as a cash cow. So while we were wrecking our industry, other countries realized the value and nurtured theirs. So, what's changed? Well, automotive management are some of the best in the world. The trade unions have transformed themselves. They look after their members, but they know that they need to have successful companies. So what's left? Government. If the Japanese can go from 0 to 10 million, we should ask ourselves, what's stopping us aspiring to a similar result? Just think how transformational that would be for the quality of life of our citizens, because we'd be creating the high-paying jobs we want, the taxes that will support our National Health Service. Our industry is a major driver of Britain's productivity agenda, its digital agenda, and its green agenda. And if we scale it, it will fund the investment in infrastructure to drive perfectly safe, totally recyclable, emission-free products. It's something I predicted 20 years ago at my presidential address at the SMMT annual dinner. So the industry has the leadership, but does the government have the vision, the appetite, the commitment, and above all, the consistency to take a long-term approach, to engage with the industry, to reach that aspirational, but historically, evidentially achievable goal. And so let me just end with another quote from General Sun Tzu, who said, "Strategy without tactics is the slowest route to victory, and tactics without strategy is the noise before the defeat." So let's make sure we're not, the noise before the defeat. Let's work together with industry and government using its convening, coordinating, consuming, and cash power to really transform this industry and transform the quality of life of our citizens, which this industry can do.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you very much. Ian, I want to come to you on this, because obviously Rachel talked about the need to have changes both in production side and in on the consumer side. What is it you think needs to change from the consumer side, from the EV adoption side, to make Britain more competitive in the future?
I think we've talked already a lot today around the price factor. There's a huge issue clearly that's stopping a lot of people jumping into electric vehicles that we can see clearly in the pricing data for new cars. We can see it even more clearly even with a TCO calculation on recent used cars. So a lot of people are worried about the residual values of their cars going forward. And you can see that quite clearly when you've got a government grant and potentially a deposit contribution from a manufacturer on the brand new vehicle, maybe subvented finance as well. You take those three things away, you've got a nearly new used EV that's looking actually literally more expensive than the brand new model, which is a challenge. Add that into the factor around people expecting, that there'll be a battery evolution and a technological sort of step forward to come. They fear being left behind. So I think we need to give longevity to our policy decisions, longevity to the support that Rachel's mentioned and so on that's in the industry, and that breeds confidence. We've got myths out there. Alison talked rightly earlier around things like torque of electric vehicles, or challenging yourself to adapt your driving style. All of those things are eminently possible, but there are myths out there where people believe that the performance of EVs isn't good, or that the reliability of EVs isn't good. They are myths that can eminently be debunked as we equally look to make them more affordable, accessible, and so on. But I think there's at the moment in our data a preponderance of wealthier, older people who are living in their own home that are buying these EVs, able to pay the green premium. And we've really got still a step to make if we're to make EVs fully accessible to the wider public.
Yeah, and obviously Ed Miliband earlier was talking about the importance of used cars, and you get them filtering in and you don't get the purchase incentives for used vehicles. And that's something that other countries have that would potentially spur a lot of activity in the market here.
Completely. I think there's been rightly calls from SMMT and others to support new and used vehicles. For example, a VAT exemption on both would be a colossal step forward, and I think it's been calculated to accelerate the rate of take-up of EVs by around 2/3. That's the kind of radical step that I think we do need to make if we're going to make a difference, and it does need to be across both new and used.
Perfect. Does anyone have any questions at this point? If you're sitting at home and thinking about whether you want to put questions in, please do. Don't be shy. You don't have to read them out. I'll read them out. Anyone have any questions in the room? Stick your hand up. No, that means you've all been perfectly clear so far. Can I talk a little bit about the pandemic? I want to know what impact it's had. Rachel, can I start with you on this? We've seen the government be pretty significantly interventionist in the pandemic in the way they've supported wages and all sorts of other things. Do you think that's a new style of government we're going to see going forward in the future?
I think yes and no, unhelpfully. I think that there is obviously this huge tension in the government now about how much money to spend. And you see it across absolutely everything in terms of the Treasury want to come to some sort of normality or sort of pre-pandemic normality and possibly pre-2019 normality, and other parts of the government very much wanting to spend. That said, this is definitely a more interventionist Conservative government than we have been used to for a long time. And in net zero, net zero is the intervention of all interventions globally and domestically, because once you make the decision that hitting net zero is a tier 1 priority, you have to intervene in everything because energy drives everything. And we heard it today. It's not only about battery supply, it's also about the energy cost to create vehicles and everything else. So yes, I think we will be more interventionist. I think the fear that others have kind of raised, and I think John was raising, is that you are a little bit interventionist in everything, but not enough to make a substantive enough difference that you get to the targets that you have.
Yeah, exactly. John, how's the pandemic been for you? How are you coming out of it? When do you think we reach pre-pandemic levels? And ultimately, is it going to have a long-term impact on competitiveness as you see it?
So look, I think the first thing to say is we should thank the Chancellor for the help he gave the industry, because it helped us to navigate through it. What was really interesting was that our factories, although we started them back up again in COVID-safe conditions, were delivering the same levels of productivity as before. And that's an interesting insight into manufacturing. Now, things we won't catch up are the lost cash flow. But some very good things came out of it, particularly the ability to drive the digital agenda more quickly. So we spent millions of pounds building digital comm cells, which is how we manage the business, but the uptake was slow. You know, human beings are creatures of habit, but then we had no choice. We had to manage our company through the digital comm cells, which means that I can go anywhere in the world, anytime, and talk to people, watch them on the shop floor, engage, coach them, support creativity, support collaboration. It doesn't do much for camaraderie, but it is in that sense, it was really helpful. Brexit did more to slow down investment in the industry because of the uncertainty. But I think the industry is able to catch back. And remember, it's got some really powerful strengths which didn't disappear with COVID, which gives us a head start on many other startup industries. And for decades, the auto industry has invested in its brands. It's invested in its global distribution channels, in its global dealer networks. Those are billions and billions of pounds of investment that simply need the right products to be driven through them. And as I was indicating earlier, the UK can make those products. And it's very clear that our factories are able to get back up to pre-production levels, subject to the availability of chips, which is a real problem right now.
And do you think you're actually, given that, during social distancing and during the pandemic, actually your productivity, you say, increased, does that mean once social distancing is over and you can cram more people into your factories, you're going to see a corresponding productivity increase in the future?
No, not at all. No, I mean, we were 2 weeks ahead of the government in implementing what we call physical distancing then in our factories, because we were learning from our global counterparts. But actually, when we started our factories, we were still implementing all of the COVID secure measures. But because of the creativity and the agility of our people, we were actually able, and I was surprised, I didn't think this would happen, but we can measure it through the OEE, and there's no question we were able to achieve in COVID secure conditions with social distancing, where appropriate with masks and surface cleaning and all the rest of it, and very significant ventilation, keeping our people safe, and also achieving pre-COVID levels of productivity.
A flurry of online questions. Thank you for those. Do keep those coming. We had a question in here. It says the UK still has a reputation for innovation, but one clear opportunity is to expand this area. But to support this, how can regulation allow us to move faster when it comes to innovation? Rachel, do you want to take this?
Yes, of course. Thank you for the question. And agree. This won't be news to the people in the room or watching, but one of the great strengths of the UK and indeed this industry is its R&D, technical and innovation capability. And I say them together because they clearly interlink with each other. And one of the things that the government has obviously tried to do in general is promise a kind of post-Brexit regulatory shift from everything from gene editing sort of onwards. We did identify a couple of areas in the report where we thought that the government could support the industry in terms of being a pilot and scale-up site here and therefore to the rest of the world, and how to use regulatory release to allow that. And that really came from the people who were listening, right, the sector. And when we talked to them about what was likely to make the biggest difference, that was one of the things that came out.
Now, we've heard occasionally in the past quite a lot about the potential Brexit dividend for the industry. Not always from this stage, though. Are there specific things now that we've left that the government can do to attract investment that it couldn't do under the old rules?
I'm not sure that any of the major top things that we identified in this report were directly impossible under the EU. In fact, one of the things that we've highlighted is how much Germany and France are indeed kind of accelerating on a lot of these areas in terms of battery supply, in terms of skills, and in terms of tax and competitiveness costs. Probably the single area is the speed with which they can affect regulatory change and therefore pilot these things, and of course the extent to which we can sign trade deals. And while trade deals certainly aren't the be-all and end-all, we did see medium upside in some of the trade deal potential in the future.
Which specific trade deals do you think?
So we didn't identify specific ones, but obviously the ones that the government is prioritising are the US. They've already signed with Japan and the general Pacific.
Okay, it was worth a try. So, question here about incentives. Maybe Ian, I'll come to you on this. Is there a risk the government incentivizes itself into a corner? It gets people so hooked on incentives that it's very difficult to wean them off, particularly once electric vehicles reach a tipping point and they're sort of no longer needed and they're very expensive for government.
No, I think on the contrary, I think when we get to that tipping point, we'll absolutely know we're there. And I think the manufacturers, Michael talked about it earlier, Alison as well, are making huge investments to get to the point where their modular and dedicated EV platforms will drive down pricing, because they'll be generating economies of scale, enabling them to do that. At the moment, with the cost of a battery and the kind of platforms they're putting those batteries into, that's simply not possible. So we need something to bridge the gap. And I do think it would be logical to imagine a scenario where you reduce gradually incentives over time. But I think in particular, it'd be very wise to telegraph the moments at which those changes are going to happen. There are risks, obviously, of doing that, but changing behavior and so on, maybe distorting things. But I think that's the kind of thing that gives people confidence. If you, for example, at the moment encourage people to buy an electric vehicle on a TCO basis, and then some people may be worrying that in the future we'll be charging for road usage. If that happens tomorrow, then my TCO calculation has gone out of the window. So tell me it's going to happen tomorrow, or don't sort of encourage me to buy a car on a TCO today. It's that kind of logic.
Exactly. There's the risk of repeating the diesel thing, where the government said, everyone buy this, everyone bought diesel cars, and now suddenly the values have collapsed. What do you see happening to used electric residual values? Because obviously this is pretty key at the moment for affordability.
Used electric values are, I think, a huge question mark out there. We couldn't give a definitive answer on that, but at the moment what I can see is that there are big pressures, particularly on the more recent vehicles and particularly on the premium models. There's a huge level of demand on our platform. We're seeing roughly 1 in 7 of our 11 million monthly uniques actually looking at an electric vehicle. So there's definitely growing interest. That's similar to what you see in terms of EV sales. So that's fantastic. There's a growing level of choice and stock and so on. But you can see that there's actually, despite the hugely increasing levels of demand, an even greater level of increasing supply of recent, particularly the premium models that have brought a lot of cars into the market recently. And with the existing price pressures I mentioned a minute ago, you don't have a subsidy on those cars anywhere above 35,000. You don't have usually manufacturer support when they're in the used car market and so on. Those vehicles are looking particularly challenging at the moment in terms of being positioned too high, and therefore likely to need a price correction. That kind of price correction is then going to probably impact the residual of the new vehicle, and we know the cycle that creates. So there is definitely a challenge there, and I think the fear that consumers have of the ongoing relevance of the tech that they're buying is holding a few people back right now. So there's no doubt a change of sales method that's probably in the pipe. And I think the digital challenge that the brands are picking up right now, along with the use of leasing tools and so on, will probably be the best way to take the EV pricing sort of challenge forward in the future. Yeah, particularly even why should I pay £30,000 for a car with 300 miles range when in 18 months' time I'll pay £18,000 for a car with the same range? It's a big challenge with the changing technology. Or twice the range. Exactly. I want to bring it back in the last few minutes talking about Britain's industrial competitiveness. John, maybe I can bring you on this. Can you talk a little bit about scale? One of the issues that Britain has when they're trying to attract international investors is we're telling them come to the UK and set up a plant here where you can sell into 1.3 million cars that we make. Whereas if they went and set one up in Germany, they'd be on the doorstep of 10 million cars or more than that. How do you see us overcoming this challenge in the future? Or do you think scale is permanently going to be something that stacks against us?
So, Peter, was that question for me?
That was for you.
Oh, look, I'm reminded of when Toyota came here and the French got very upset by saying that Britain had parked a Japanese automotive aircraft carrier off the coast of Europe. And that proved to be incredibly successful strategy. So, we have to make really sure that we have regulatory alignment and that we re-engage constructively with the biggest, closest, richest free trade market in the world. Of course, those other markets are important and they're growing quickly, but they're not nearly as big. So, I really think it's important that we re-engage in a constructive and positive way with our biggest markets, and that we're really careful to ensure regulatory alignment. You put £1 on the price of a car, that's £1 million off your bottom line. £1,000 is devastating. So it's really important that we, work as effectively together as we can, and don't try and think we can rely on the UK market. We can't. It's a market which people can come to and export successfully to the world. I mean, Japan, as I said in my opening sort of response to your question, was miles from its markets, and it was incredibly successful. There are really effective transportation systems now which are low cost to get cars all over the world. So as long as the UK is a great place to design them, develop them, make them, sell them, and use them, we then create the infrastructure that enables us to make competitive products. But they do have to be sold to world markets for companies to be willing to come here and invest here.
You don't mention parking an aircraft carrier off the coast of France. You'll give the current Prime Minister ideas. Rachel, can I come to you on this as well? How important was scale when you were looking at Britain, particularly benchmarking against other European competitors?
I mean, it mattered, and so did friction, right? I mean, of course, that was one of the big inputs into the different scenarios, and the extent to which there is friction between us and different markets. I'm going to completely ignore your question, if I'm okay, because I really want to come back to something that Ian said, because I think it is so crucial, which is the long-term nature of what we do. Because the thing that came up again and again in every focus group that we did was this exact point from individuals about long-term trust. And it's the diesel thing that they bring up again and again. It's whether they want to go into a green job because they think the government might invest in it for a while and then it will disappear. And it's people who feel that this has happened to them over the last 30 years. And unless they think that the promises that are made to them will follow through, they're not going to change their behaviour because they feel they've seen it before. So if I had sort of one other message other than the kind of core nature of this industry to the government's objectives, to the government, it is that. Like, they have to convince people to switch and to change their behaviour. At the moment, they're very worried that the rug's going to get pulled from underneath them.
Yeah, exactly. The need for long-term planning. It's obviously questions there we're going to be able to hopefully put to the Business Secretary when he speaks here this afternoon. I'm afraid we're out of time. Thank you to you at home or the office for asking your questions. We tried to get through as many of those as we could. Thank you to our panellists as well for your time. Thank you to John for joining us remotely. It's time for a break now. Now, if you're at home, that means it's going to be a slightly shorter queue for coffee than there is here in the building. We've got about half an hour. If you can be back in your seats at 11:20, we're going to be hearing from Aston Martin and McLaren about the future of specialist manufacturing in the UK. Still lots more to come. We'll see you after the break. Thank you.